All right, everyone, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Baruch Hashem, Shechianu v'kimanu v'gyanu. Our last step of Sanhedrin. Pleasure to thank all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor, annual Talmud Torah sponsor for Tafshin Pei Hey, Naftali Tilson and Mishpacha for dedicating all of his Sherman Joshua this year as a zechus for Besaros Tavos for Am Yisrael. Paul Pollack. In celebration, Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Nisan Abba Le'en Tov, in celebration of the Nisan birthdays of his wife Kathy and his granddaughter Tikva Esther Pollack. An anonymous Talmud Torah sponsorship in the schus of Simchas for all of our children, and for Nisan to be the month of Geula Shlema for all of Klal Yisrael. And Avram and Shane Kelman, in memory of Avram's mother, Sarah Braina Bas Yoshua Heschel. Our week of learning sponsor, Steve Galaskov, in honor of all of the bracha that Hashem has provided for me, Jordana, and our family. And our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, Reb Mordechai Tusk, Le'ilui Nishmas, Tzvi Menachem Ben Avram Aryeh Zichron Livracha. And get ready for this. And on the occasion of Reb Mordechai's completion of Shas. Mazel Tov, Reb Mordechai. Incredible. Shabi and Aliyah for your father's neshama, a nechama for your mishpacha, and a tremendous zechus for you and for the entire mishpacha for many years to come. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. And Mordechai is actually going to be our Messiah tomorrow morning at the Siyam Amir Hashem. All right, well, so with that, let us begin today. There is no catch-up. Today, there is no, don't worry, we'll make up ground tomorrow. Today is Mamish, this is the day. This is it. This is when we make it all happen. This is when it all comes together. Today's daf is Kuf Yud Gimel, 113. We are picking up Amir Hashem on Kuf Yud Beis Mabeis 112b. And we are picking up Amir Hashem 2, 4, 6, 7 lines down from the top. So remember, we're going to say we are going through the fascinating sugya of Ir Nidachas, tragic yet fascinating as well, of Ir Nidachas. And specifically, we're focusing now on when you destroy the Ir Nidachas, what is included, what is excluded. So the Gemara says, Amar Mar, Hayu Ba Kadshim Beach Yamusu. If there are karbanos, literally again, animals or items that, it doesn't just be animals, but items that are sanctified for offering up on the Mizbeach, Yamusu. Ultimately, again, the animals, they are left to die. They're left to die. The Gemara now says, generally, when we say Yamusu never means actively put to death. Rather, what Yamusu means is usually they're just deprived of food and left to die. Left to die. The Gemara says, why Yamusu? Why? There's a better mechanism. What's the better mechanism? Let them graze until they develop a mom, which will inevitably happen, and then go ahead and sell them off and utilize and just essentially transfer the sanctity onto the money. Let the animal become schulin, and let the animal itself be redeemed. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, zevach resham to'eva. No, because remember, who does this carbon belong to? This carbon belongs to a rasha, belongs to a member of Ir Nidachas. We don't want that carbon. I don't want it. No one wants it. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says to go ahead and offer it would be almost like an affront, and therefore halacha l'maisa again, we actually let it die. Reish Lakish says mamon bailimhu. Reish Lakish says ultimately again, it's considered to be the property of the owner. It's mamon bailim. Now because it's property of the owner, what's the halacha of all property of members of Ir Nidachas? It's destroyed. It's destroyed. So the Gemara says, here we're talking about, by the way, the situation that we're dealing with is kachim for which you have achrayis. I will say, again, without getting into too much of the weeds here, but remember, in different types of kachim achrayis means what happens if you designate a carbon and something happens to it. Are you obligated to replace it, or do we say no? Whatever happened, happened. So the Gemara is suggesting over here that in this case we're talking about karbanos for which you have achrayis, which means if something happens to the carbon, you are obligated to go ahead and replace it. Rabbi Shimon holds that halacha l'maisa, any carbon for which you have achrayis, by definition, is your property. And if it is your property, then halacha l'maisa has got to be destroyed as part of Ir Nidachas. Here's the problem. Hamid the Sefer Rabbi Shimon, Reish Lav Rabbi Shimon. Here's the problem. Since the Sefer explicitly articulates that it's positioned Rabbi Shimon, B'pashtos the Reish is not Rabbi Shimon. So which the Gemara says, B'kachim kalim ba'alibud Rabbi Yossi Lili. You're right. What are we talking about over here? We're talking about kachim kalim, which is lower sanctity karbanos. In accordance with Rabbi Yossi Lili, what does he say? The Amar kachim kalim mamon bailim. Because again, kachim kalim, which is lower sanctity karbanos, that's when we say that it's the property of the owner. Aval kadshe kadoshim. What happens to kadshe kadoshim? Higher sanctity karbanos in achinami yiptu. The halach is you could redeem them. Now, by the way, the process for redemption, as we just said before, you let the animal graze, develop a mum, and once it develops a mum, you sell it off. Sanctity is transferred onto the money, and the animal itself becomes chulin. So the Gemara says, "Adatani seifa kadshe bedek habayis yiptu." So if that's the case, if now you're setting this up as so now if that's the way we're establishing this, that the carbon case that we're talking about, where the carbon has to be left to die, is the case ultimately of Kodshim Kalim. And Kodshim Kalim, we say, is Mamon Bailin. It's the property of the owner, and therefore it has to be destroyed. If that's how you're setting it up, then we should change the safe of this price. So why? The Gemara says, because what did the price say? Well, when is this? Bekachim Kalim. This is talking about lower sanctity karbanos. Aval Kodshe Kadoshim, when it comes to Kodshe Kadoshim, I'm sorry. Adatani Seifa, I'm skipping line. Adatani Seifa, Kodshe Bedek Habayis Yiptu. Once it said that Kodshe Bedek Habayis, ultimately, now remember, what's Kodshe Bedek Habayis? Kodshe Bedek Habayis refers to consecrated items that are dedicated to temple upkeep, right? And ultimately, again, meaning that halacha l'maisa, this financial sanctity, not physical sanctity. So that when we said Kodshe Bedek Habayis Yiptu, liflog v'lisnei b'didei, let's go ahead and make an internal division based on that previous information. What should we say? When is this so? When is what so? When is it so that halacha l'maisa, we go ahead and let karbanos die in the nidachas? When is that so? Bekadshim kalim. That's true with karbanos of lesser sanctity because they are considered to be mamon bailin. They are ultimately, again, the property of the owner. Aval kodshe kadoshim yiptu. But kodshe kadoshim, ultimately, again, those are redeemed. So the Gemara says, Kevan de'ika chat. Why not just go ahead and say it like that? To which the Gemara says, Kevan de'ika chat shemesu ba'ala. No, because at the end of the day, you can't go ahead and even for Kodshe Kadoshim, the same process doesn't work for all things, right? For example, for some Kodshe Kadoshim, the process will be let the animal graze, develop a moment, and sell it up. But for example, it doesn't work for everything. For example, chatos, a carbon chatos, that process doesn't work. Carbon chatos, everyone agrees, the animal itself is left to die, it's left to starve, and it just dies. So since you don't have a uniform process for Kodshe Kadoshim, you can't say it that way. Okay, so Bishlan Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. So I'll say, now going back for just a second. So now I understand why Rabbi Yochanan doesn't say like Reish Lakish. Tichsev Zevach Rishayim Toiva. Remember again, Rabbi Yochanan holds that halacha l'maisa, there's no redemption for the karbanos. Why? Because Rabbi Yochanan holds that the notion of going ahead and bringing the carbon of a rasha to the Beis Hamikdash is unfathomable. Can't do that. That Zevach Hashem To'iva, the offering of a rasha, is an abomination. El Reish Lakish, my time Rabbi Yochanan. But why does Reish Lakish not hold like Rabbi Yochanan? Amar Lacha, so Reish Lakish would say, Ki Amrina Zevach Hashem To'iva. When we say that the offering of a rasha is a To'iva, Hani Mili Hecha Disnu Beinayu. That's true when the carbon itself is in existence. In other words, if there's a rasha and the rasha has a carbon ola, right, has a shla, has a nedava, you can't bring that because to bring the carbon of a rasha, that's considered to be abominative. However, aval hacha kevan de ishtani. By the way, Ari Elman, you could add that to the made-up words list. Abominative. Right, so again, so the Maisa, if however, halacha l'maisa, kevan de ishtani, right? But at the end of the day, if it changed, then ultimately again it's changed. Now what does that mean? So we'll say this is very interesting. So Rish Lakish will say like this: when can't you bring the carbon of a rasha? When the actual carbon itself, right? The rasha has a carbon that has a shlomim. You can't bring that carbon. But if that carbon changes, what does it mean it changes? Let's say again, that carbon develops a mum. Now you have money, right? And that money now is going to be used for the base. I mean, it's used for something else. That's okay. So as I say, interestingly enough, that's the fundamental machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan will say the carbon of a rasha in any form is problematic. But ultimately, again, Rabbi Yochanan will say, that's Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish will say that it's only problematic if it's in original form. If it changes form, then it's going to be mutter. So will say, if you think about it, it's a tremendous musar haskell. What's the musar haskell? Right? When is the carbon, according to Reish Lakish, when is the carbon of the rasha rejected? When it's unchanged. But the moment that it changes is the moment that it's accepted. In life, sometimes we make tremendous mistakes. And in those moments of tremendous mistake, the truth is, to a certain degree, there's a piece of us that's rejected. Because the Rasha can't come close. The Rasha is really kept at a distance. Zevach Reshaim To'iva. Whatever the Rasha wants to offer up, that's an abomination. But here's the incredible news. It's okay. Just don't stay a Rasha. Just don't stay a Rasha. Just change form. Just change what you are. Just change who you are. Just affect some level of change within your life and don't be the Rasha anymore. And suddenly, anything and everything you want to give is accepted. Overwhelming Musar Haskell. The Gemara goes weiter. Rabbi Shimon says again, the only thing, again, back to property of an Ir Nidachas. So remember again, in the Ir Nidachas, what is destroyed? Your animals. Your animals. However, again, any animal of Bechar and Meiser, so Bechar, remember again, firstborn sanctity, Meiser Sheni, is not destroyed. So my asking, what's the case? So again, if we're talking about like an unblemished Bechar and just a regular Meiser Sheni animal, Shalal Shamayimhu. So that's obvious that it's not destroyed as part of Ir Nidachas. Why? Because that belongs to the Ribono Shalom. That's not personal property. Ella B'Bali Mumin. So ultimately, again, maybe it's talking about Bali Mumin. Well, if it's Bali Mumin, Shlala Ninhu, then ultimately, again, that's the property of the member of the Ir Nidachas, and that's prohibited. Fine. Amravino, the Olam B'Bali Mumin. So really, it's talking about Bali Mumin. Umishin Echab. So listen to this. It's very interesting. So we'll say, so if it's Bali Mumin, so let's say I have a Bechar. I have a firstborn animal. What's the halacha? What do you do with the firstborn animal? What do you do with it? What do you do with the firstborn animal? Give it to a Kohen. If the animal develops a mum on its own, right? If you go and you blemish it and say, oh well, it's blemished, right? That doesn't work. But if it becomes blemished on its own, then it's my animal. So the Gemara says like this. What are we talking about over here? We're talking about, let's say, for example, a blemished Bechar. Now, if it's a blemished Bechar, that's my animal. If it's my animal, then it should be destroyed as part of the property of Ir Nidachas. Why would it be excluded? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because the Torah is very specific. When the Torah speaks about the property that is destroyed in Ir Nidachas, it identifies behemtecha, your animal. What does your animal mean? Yatsu elu she'ein ne'echalin b'toras behemtecha ela b'toras b'char u'meiser d'shalal shamayim minhu. So here's what's interesting. Even though an unblemished bechar ultimately, again, is yours to consume, yours to utilize, but its origination point is not as your animal. Behemtecha means an animal that was yours and solely yours from the beginning, but something that had consecrated status. Even if now that consecrated status changed, halacha l'maisa, that's not your animal. That's not your animal. And because it's not your animal, therefore, again, even though now it's permitted for usage, that is not to be destroyed with the Ir Nidachas. Upliga de Shmuel, because again, since its origination point was the animal of the Ribono Shalom. Upliga de Shmuel, this argues on Shmuel. Damar Shmuel, hakol karav, v'akol nifte. So Shmuel says, makes a pretty, a strange statement. Everything is offered and everything is redeemed. What does that mean? My kamar, haki kamar, kol shekarav kishuhu tam, v'nifte kishu bamum. This is very interesting. Any animal that is offered up when it's unblemished and can be redeemed when it is blemished, mishalal imit, is excluded from destruction of Ir Nidachas, because that's called the Ribono Shel Olam's property. The Chol Shekarav Kishu Tam, the Eino Nifta Kishu Bamum, but anything that ultimately, again, is offered up or has Kedusha when it's unblemished. But ultimately, again, once it develops a blemish, it's no longer offered up, and it doesn't need to go through a redemptive process. Kigon, Bechar Umaiser, Mebehema Nafka. It's excluded from Ir Nidachas, ultimately, again, based on the word behema. So we'll say what's coming out from here is something very interesting. There are two different ways in which an animal would be excluded from destroyed property in Ir Nidachas. So number one would be if an animal is fully consecrated and then it is redeemed. Then it's redeemed, because ultimately, again, even if it's been redeemed, that's still called the property of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But interestingly enough, if you have, let's say, a Bechar, so remember again, Bechar never needs to go through a redemption process. You have a Bechar, so it's sanctified. If it develops a mum, it's mundane. But there is no consecration process that needs to be done. It's just a de facto, like a decommission from the Bechar status. That animal is also excluded from being destroyed in Ir Nidachas. Why? Based on the word behemtecha. Behemtecha means what kind of animal is destroyed in Ir Nidachas? Your animal. What does your animal mean? It was yours and no one else's from the beginning. When I say no one else's, means the Ribono Shalom never had a hold on it. Because Baruch Hu has some type of tfisa, some type of hold on it. Even if that hold subsequently changes now, the animal is still excluded from destruction of the Eir Nidachas. Incredible. Okay, truma yirkavu. If there's truma in the Eir Nidachas, you let it rot. You let it rot. So we'll say, so again, remember, we saw in yesterday's daf, remember, not everyone in the Eir Nidachas necessarily is evil. All you need is the majority of people to be of the avodah zarah. Then they get. But remember, we saw yesterday, you can have tzaddikim. Tzaddikim aren't killed. Their property is destroyed, but they're not killed. So if you have truma in the Eir Nidachas, what do you do with it? Truma's kodesh. What do you do with it? You let it rot. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Chisda, Lo Shon Ela Trumos B'Yad Yisrael. Very interesting. When we say truma has to rot, where's the truma? The truma is in the hands of the Yisrael. So Ami Yisrael, much to my chagrin, Ami Yisrael, so I have truma, and I haven't yet given it to the Kohen. So now again, that's when Rav Chisda, that's the Gemara says, so what do I do with it? I'm in the Eir Nidachas, what do I do with it? I let it rot. The Gemara says, Aval truma b'yad Kohen, kevan demamone hu tisarif. Oh, but remember, if the truma was given to the Kohen, once truma comes into the hands of a Kohen, that's his property. That's his property. Once it's his property, then what's the halacha? You have to destroy it along with all the other property in Eir Nidachas. Master Rav Yosef is the kasha. Meiser Sheni, the Kisvei Kodesh Yignizu. The Mishnah said, the Meiser Sheni and Kisvei Kodesh, any type of holy writings, have to be buried. Shemus. I have a Meiser Sheni b'yad Yisrael, Kitrum b'yad Kohen Dami. For a second, this is very interesting. Meiser Sheni in the hands of Yisrael is like truma in the hands of a Kohen. And yet, again, what does it say? So, we just said that truma in the hands of a Kohen, what happens to it? Should be destroyed because it's his mammon. But Meiser Sheni then should be my mammon and should be destroyed as well. Yet it doesn't say it should be destroyed. It says it should be hidden away, or not hidden away, buried. So rather, it says it should be buried. Ella itmar hachi itmar. Here's what I have to say. Here we go. Amar Rav Chisda, lo shana ela truma b'yad Kohen. When do we say that ultimately again truma is nignas? When is that? When it's truma in the hands of a Kohen. Aval truma b'yad Yisrael tinasin lekohen shebe'ir acheres. So I'll say this is very interesting. So what do you do with truma in the hands of Yisrael? What do you do there? It's fascinating. You go ahead and you move that to a different city. Send that to a Kohen in a different city. So I'll say this is really quite a fascinating idea. So truma in the hands of Yisrael, it doesn't belong to me. Doesn't belong to you, right? It's not mine. So watch this. So because it's not mine, therefore it's not what? It's not my property. Because it's not my property, therefore, it doesn't have to be destroyed in a Eir Nidachas. So what do I do? There's a very simple idea. Send it to a Kohen in a different city. That's all. Just get it out of the city and give it to a different Kohen. Fascinating. So Tanan Hassam we learned Isa Shal Meiser Sheni P'tura Min. So I'll say just fascinating halacha that if the truma is in the hands of the Kohen, then ultimately, again, it has to rot. But Lamaisa, again, if halacha Lamaisa, it is in the hands of the Yisrael, get it out of the city and give it to another Kohen. Fascinating. So Tanan Hassam, we learned, Isa Shal Meiser Sheni P'tura Min Echala Diramer. So interesting halacha. If you have dough of Meiser Sheni is pater from Chala. Right? Remember again, normally if I'm Yisrael, I'm making dough, I have to give a portion of my dough to the Kohen. That is the obligation of Chala. Meiser Sheni dough is pater from Chala. Divrei Meir. Chum say no, you're obligated to give Chala even from the dough of Meiser Sheni. Amar Rav Chisda, machlokes by Meiser Sheni Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is very interesting. The machlokes over here is when it comes to Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim itself. Why? The Rabbi Meir holds Meiser Sheni Mamon Gavohu. Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa. Rabbi Meir holds that Meiser Sheni belongs to Hashem. I have the right to eat it and the right to consume it, but it belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because it belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, therefore what? Therefore, halacha l'maisa is pater from Chala. Rabbanan Savri, Rabbanan hold, Mamon Hedyotu. No, Meiser Sheni belongs to me. It has certain strictures which dictate how it's to be consumed, but it belongs to me. Because it belongs to me, therefore what? It's chayv in chala. So the Gemara says, Aval bigvulin, but Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim, Tirvia kol pater. First one, both at the bottom, everyone agrees. Ultimately, again, it's pater from chala. So Master Rav Yosef raised the kasha. Meiser Sheni v'kisei kodesh ignizus. Let's go at the Eir Nidachas. So right, what do we say about Eir Nidachas? What happens to Meiser Sheni? What happens to Meiser Sheni? It's buried. It's buried. So Gemara says, what's going on over here? B'mai eskinan. Ilem b'Yerushalayim. So if you're talking about Meiser Sheni Yerushalayim, this is fascinating. So the Gemara says, Mi havya Eir Nidachas. This is fascinating. Yerushalayim can never become an Eir Nidachas. Yerushalayim can never become an Ir Nidachas. So the Gemara says, Vatanya, Asar Dvarim Ne'emar Yerushalayim. There are 10 unique features of Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, V'zu Achas Mehen. And ultimately, again, this is one of them. Eina Na'asis Ir HaNidachas. Ultimately, again, it can never become an Ir Nidachas. I will say, so again, there's the reason for that, by the way, if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, no, Rashi, sorry. The reason that why is because remember, the pasuk talks about the idea that Ir Nidachas is one of the. It happens in a city that was given to a l'rishtecha for you to acquire. There's a whole yisod that Yerushalayim lo nischalka l'shvatim. Yerushalayim belongs to all of Klal Yisrael and does not belong to any particular shevet. So because Yerushalayim doesn't belong to a shevet, right? It belongs to everyone. Even though, again, just want to point out, Yerushalayim falls in the tribal area of Yehuda and Binyamin, right? Remember again, the line between Yehuda and Binyamin actually cut through the Kodesh HaKadosh and the Beis HaMikdash, right? But yet Yerushalayim itself belonged to everyone. So I'll say it's also just a beautiful thing about this, that this lashon over here, this lashon is Yerushalayim Eino Nasa. What's the lashon? Eino Nasis Ir HaNidachas. Okay, so we translate Ir HaNidachas ultimately again as a city that worships idolatry, but the etymological root, what does Ir HaNidachas mean? A city that is cast aside. A city that is cast aside. Yerushalayim is never cast aside. Yerushalayim as a city has been through so much over the millennia, right? But yet one thing is clear, which is Yerushalayim is never fully pushed away from us. It's never nidach, right? The connection between the Yid and Yerushalayim is an unbreakable bond. And it doesn't matter throughout history who has occupied it, and it doesn't matter throughout history who has lived there, who has ruled over it. Yerushalayim has and always will be the eternal capital of Am Yisrael. It can never be an Ir Nidachas, not just through Avodah Zarah, but it can never be fully pushed away from Klal Yisrael. Incredible. Ella be'ir acheres. So what's the case over here? What's the case? We're just trying to figure out the case of where Meiser Sheni would be buried. What is that case? Ve'ella be'ir acheres. We must be talking about again. Obviously, Meiser Sheni in a different city, not Yerushalayim, in a city that could become an Ir Nidachas. Vaskua legava. And interestingly enough, we're talking about a case where a person brought the Meiser Sheni into Yerushalayim itself. If that's the case, hakatua mechitzos. Once the mechitzos of Yerushalayim absorb the Meiser Sheni, it's absorbed. To which the Gemara says, Ella lav bigvulin. Rather, once again, we must be talking about Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim. Vekatani yignizu. And ultimately, again, we see that's what's the halacha. It has to be buried away. Now, what do you see from here? What you see from here is that halacha l'maisa, Meiser Sheni is considered to be the property of the owner, right? That's why if it's in the Ir Nidachas, it has to be destroyed, or in this case, again, hidden away, buried. What's the case? I will say, interestingly enough, we're talking about, Meiser Sheni that originated in another city, but was now brought to Yerushalayim, and that previous city, that former city, became an Ir Nidachas. I'm asking, what's the case? Shenitma, where it became Tameh. But if it became Tameh, the Gemara says, I don't understand, but okay, just redeem it. So, how do we know that if Meiser Sheni became Tameh, that you're allowed to redeem it even in Yerushalayim itself? Talmud Lomar, lo suchal seiso. Ve'ein seis el achila. Seis means, right, if you're unable to go ahead, if you're unable to eat it, then ultimately, again, you have the ability to go ahead and redeem it. Now the pasuk over here, lo suchal seis, so actually is talking about, again, if Baruch Hashem, you have so much Meiser Sheni, and you live a good distance from Yerushalayim, so you can take the produce. What can you do? You could redeem the produce onto money, bring the money to Yerushalayim. But the Gemara also darshes lo suchal seis. So seis also means to eat. To eat. If let's say you're unable to eat Meiser Sheni, now why would one be unable to eat their Meiser Sheni? Because it became Tameh. If that's the case, then halacha l'maisa, you can go ahead and redeem it. Then says elachil shneimar vayisa masas meis panav. You know what's the case? Bilakuach. So also this is very interesting. Before you turn, look at Rashi. Rashi bilakuach. Last Rashi on the daf. Shekvar hotzia b'hotzah lekasef meiser v'nasnua b'yayin v'shecharu basra v'nitma. Also lakuach. Tahu lesle pediya. Oh, what happened? I brought money of Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim, so that's halacha, right? If I have Baruch Hashem, I have a lot of Meiser Sheni. I can't carry it out to Yerushalayim, so what do? I redeem it onto money, I bring the money to Yerushalayim, and I have to use the money to buy food. And I come to Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, I buy food. Now what happens? That food becomes tamei. So most of the halacha is, as much as Meiser Sheni that is tamei can be redeemed, but food bought with Meiser Sheni money, if that becomes tamei, that can't be redeemed, which makes sense. In other words, it's a bit too far off the source to avail itself of the redemptive process. So I'm asking on Belakuach, top of Kof Yud Gimel. Let's say last daf of Masechah Sanhedrin. I velifrake. I don't understand. Right? Still, why can't I redeem it? It's not. After all, we learned. Halakuach b'maiser sheni shenit ma yifta. Again, they will say that we have a Mishnah that indicates that even food items bought with maiser sheni money can in fact be redeemed. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda the Amar diikvar, because Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that says that Allah Chalamaisa, no, if you have food that was bought with money of maiser sheni, that has to be buried. The Gemara ihachi, if that's the case, my iria irni dachas. Why are you bringing up irni dachas? Afilu da'alma nami. This would be true anytime. In other words, this is not a din of irni dachas. Then this is true in general. In other words, we'll say, since the halacha is, if I take maiser sheni money to Yerushalayim, I use the money to go ahead and purchase food, which is what I'm supposed to do. Then that food becomes tamei. I can't redeem that food. So what do you do with it? What do you do with it? The answer is bury it. If that's the case, that's not a unique halacha by irni dachas. That's halacha ma'aser sheni. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, you're right. We're talking about ma'aser sheni tar. And what happened? Kigon denafal mechitzos. It's very interesting. What happened? That halacha l'ma'aser, the walls, the mechitzos of Yerushalayim fell. Ukiderav damarava mechitza lechol daraisa liklot drabanon. Ultimately, in order to eat ma'aser sheni Yerushalayim, you need mechitzos midaraisa, and ultimately, again, once you bring the ma'aser sheni into the walls, right, the walls absorb them, so to speak, and endow them with kedusha midrabanan. V'chigaz rabanan. When did Chazal go? When were they goes around this? Ki istu lemechitza. Ultimately, again, only when the mechitza stood, when the walls stood. Ki lesnu mechitza. But if the walls are not standing low, then ultimately, again, they're not gozer. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, the way it works is like this. So it seems we're talking about a very specific case of ma'aser sheni, of an irni dachas that was brought to Yerushalayim, and when it was there, the walls fell. The walls fell, right? Now, so just also, the ma'aser, let me say it better. The ma'aser sheni from another city was brought to Yerushalayim. Before that city became an irni dachas. After the ma'aser sheni came to Yerushalayim, the city became an irni dachas, and then the walls fell down. Now, once the walls fell, so there's a lot happening over here. Once the walls fell down, I can't eat the ma'aser sheni there anymore. But now, also remember again, this is property of an irni dachas. So therefore, what's the halacha? That's the unique case where the halacha will be that you bury the ma'aser sheni. Okay, fine. So say so good. That's that specific case. Good. Let's go weiter. Kisvei kodesh yignizu. If I have holy writings, right? Again, svarim, sifrei Torah, in a irni dachas, they have to be buried. So the Gemara says, Mastis and Rabbi Lazar. Both say this is fascinating. Our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Lazar. Why does Rabbi Lazar say? Listen to this. Tesanya, Rabbi Lazar Omer, Kol ir sheyesh ba'afilu mezuzah achas, eino na'asis irani dachas. So Rabbi Lazar say, listen to this. This is actually a tremendous Gemara. Rabbi Lazar says, any city that has even one mezuzah in it, just one mezuzah, can't become an irani dachas. Why not? Shenemar, v'sarafta ba'esh es ha'ir v'es kol shlala kalil. Because we'll say, what is that like irani dachas? What do you destroy in irani dachas? What do you destroy? Everything. Now here's so in other words, what Rabbi Lazar is saying is like this. In order for a city to be irani dachas, you have to be able to destroy everything. If you can't destroy everything, then by definition, it's not an irani dachas. So therefore he says, literally, if there's not a mezuzah, it can't become an irani dachas. To which the Gemara says, sorry, good. And if there is a mezuzah in the city, you're not able to destroy everything. Ultimately, again, because the pasuk says you're not allowed to do this. Do this means by avodah zarah, the obligation is to destroy all avodah zarah. And the Torah says that which you do to avodah zarah, do not do to the Ribono Shel Olam. So therefore, again, I can't destroy mezuzah. So because I can't destroy mezuzah on a technical level, it wouldn't be able to become an irani dachas. So just what the Gemara is pointing out over here is there's machlokas, right? Because the Mishnah says if there's kisvei kodesh, what would be included in kisvei kodesh? a mezuzah. So the Mishnah says, what do you do with the mezuzahs, the Sifrei Torah, the Sfarim? Now, what do? You bury them, Keniza, right? You put in Shemus. And yet the Gemara just says, by the way, there's just another opinion. Other opinion says that if you're in a place where there are kisvei kodesh, like a mezuzah, other things, halacha l'maisa, that city can't become an ir hanidachas. So just an interesting machlokes. Okay, Rabbi Shimon Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So what Rabbi Shimon says as follows. Rabbi Shimon says, now again, this was the end of the Mishnah. Right, end of the Mishnah. So what happened over here? Good. So Rabbi Elazar said, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Good. Let's actually just see in the Gemara. So Rabbi Elazar said, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So here we go. Lema b'Rabbi Abin. Amar Rabbi Elazar kamiflagi. Listen to this. Kol makom she'ata motzei klal ba'asei uprat below sasei ein danin osa beklal uprat. Okay, so we'll say now, what is this? Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, it's almost right across in Rashi. Klal ba'asei uprat below sasei kigon. This is by the end of the Mishnah, where we speak about again, what can you do about rebuilding of the Erni Dachas. So remember again, we had a machlokes between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, right? So ultimately, again, good. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili said that halacha l'maisa, you can't go ahead and do anything on that site. The Erni Dachas just remains a ruin. Not only can you rebuild the city, you can't even go ahead and do gardens and orchards. Rabbi Akiva said you can't rebuild the city to what it once was, but you can make it into gardens and orchards. So take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Klal ba'asei uprat below sasei kigon v'haisa tel olam. The pasuk says by Erni Dachas, you have to leave it a desolate mound. That's the assay, right? Tafilu ganos upardesim lo, right? Lo sasa. Ella siye tel olam shu assay lo si bane od. So again, so there's two things over here. There's an assay of v'haisa tel olam, leave it desolate. And then there's a lo saseh of lo sibane od. Do not rebuild this city. So the Gemara says, Binyamat v'havi lo saseh. So the halacha is like this. Now go back to the Gemara for just a moment. Keep your hand in that Rashi. So kol makom she'ata motzei klal ba'aseh. So here again, you have a klal and an aseh, right? What's the klal and aseh, right? So v'haisa tel olam, it should be in a mound, and prat below saseh, lo sibane od. Now that's called a prat because what that sounds like is you can't rebuild the city as it was. So that's the prat. So I have a klal and an aseh, a prat in a lo saseh, ein danin osa beklalu prat. So Rabbi Lai holds you cannot darshan that as that's not a typical klalu prat, and therefore it can't be darshaned as a klalu prat. So what's the halacha? So now what's going on over here? Demar islay Rabbi Abin, or let's say Rabbi Abin. One opinion holds like Rabbi Abin, and one opinion rejects Rabbi Abin. That's the machlokes over here. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not the machlokes. No, to Kuli Amay is like Rabbi Abin. Everyone agrees with Rabbi Abin's assessment that whenever you have this interesting type of klalu prat, where you have the klal and an asay, and the prat and a lo sasay, you can't darshan it as a klalu prat. But that's not the machlokes. What is the machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili? What is the machlokes? Listen to this. Mar savar, od legamrei mashma, umar savar od lekama shahaisa. This is very interesting. Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds that the word lo sibane od, you can't rebuild the city anymore. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that means for anything. You can't do anything with this destroyed city. You have to leave it a desolate mound. Just a desolate mound, right? And therefore, again, nakanos, napardesim, nothing. And Rabbi Akiva understands to mean what? You can't rebuild it to what it once was. So you can't rebuild the city to what it once was, but you absolutely can make it into gardens and into orchards. Incredible. So that's Rabbi Akiva, right? Rabbi Akiva holds that halacha l'maisa again. You can't rebuild it into the city, into the former glory, but you can make it into gardens and orchards. So here we go. How you bought Ilana solution? Very interesting case. If there were detached trees in the Erni Dachas, right? So again, I have Erni Dachas and there are detached trees. What's the halacha? Asurin, they're asur. They're asur. In other words, meaning they have to be destroyed. Michubarin, what happens if the trees were attached to the ground? Mutarin. Ultimately, again, they're mutar. Now, I'll say, now, what's the reason for that? Rashi points out over here, because what the Torah says, Ba'ir Nidachas, is that the tikbots, the kabatzta, you will collect and you will burn. So anything that is readily collectible and destroyable. But a tree has to first what? Be detached. So because there is that extra step, therefore it's not included in the destruction of Ir Hanidachas. The Gemara says, Shal Ir Acheres, if you have trees from another city in the Ir Hanidachas, Bein Telushin, Bein Mechubarin, Aser. Ultimately, again, whether they are detached or attached, ultimately, again, they will be destroyed. So what does that mean? My Yirachar, what does it mean from a different city? Amar Chista, Yericho. Oh, okay, we'll say a different kind of city. City of Yericho. What happened in Yericho? Dichsiv. V'haisaha ir cherem laHashem. V'yishba Yoshua. By Esa Hilemor. Arura ish lifnei Hashem asher yakum ubana sa'ir azos. Es Yericho. Bivchoro yisadena ubitziro yatziv dalaseha. So I will say there is a different halacha by Yericho. By Yericho was made cherem. Right? When Yoshua conquered Yericho, he made an oath, he made Klal Yisrael take an oath. Literally, again, cursed is the man before Hashem who will rebuild this city. With his eldest son, he will lay the foundation stone, and with his youngest sons, he will set up the doors, which means Yoshua cursed whoever will rebuild Yericho, ultimately, again, will Chas Hashem Rachmana Litzlan lose his children. So I will say, the Gemara suggests like this: if you have trees from Yericho in the Ir Nidachas, that's destroyed. Whether they are attached trees, meaning like replanted trees, or ultimately again detached trees, because Yericho as a city is in Cherem, but in times of Yoshua. So Tanya, so also this is fascinating brayso. Lo Yericho Hashem Ir Acheres, v'lo Ir Acheres Hashem Yericho. This is fascinating. There are two prohibitions. You cannot rebuild the city of Yericho, even if you call it another name, right? You can't rebuild on that site even if you call it another name. And ultimately, again, you also can't make another city called Yericho. You're not allowed to make another city called Yericho. That's the Cherem of Yoshua. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So the Gemara gives an example of this. Bana Hiel Beis Ha'ili Es Yericho Ba'aviram Becharo Yasta or Biskuf Sa'aro Hitziv Dalasel. Because the Navi tells a story about a guy by the name of Hiel. Hiel rebuilt a city called Yericho. Now, interestingly enough, he did not rebuild Yericho on the site of Yericho. Rather, he built another city called Yericho in a different location. And yet, what happened? Amazing, tragically enough, right? Ba'aviram b'charo yasta. When he started rebuilding it, he lost his son. Aviram, and then he lost, we'll see in just a little bit, he actually lost all of his children during the construction process, and ultimately when he put up the doors of this city, his youngest son, Skuv, died. So from here you see that not only are you not allowed to rebuild Yericho on the site of Yericho, but again, you're also not allowed to build another city called Yericho itself. So Tanya, Ba'aviram b'charo Rasha lo hayel lo lilmod, u'b'skuf tzira hayel lo lilmod. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says, Baisa says, perhaps with the death of Aviram, his oldest son, he could not have known that what he was doing was wrong. But by the time he got ultimately again to the loss of his youngest son, who was losing children successively, he should have realized that something was wrong with what he was doing. To which the Gemara says, Aviram uskuv my avid. What did Aviram and Skuv do? What was their fault that they were punished like this? So Gemara says, Hachi Kamar. This is what it means to say. Ba'aviram b'choro hayelo lilmod la'osa rasha b'skuv tziro. So again, Simon is just saying, again, it's really an indictment of Hiel. How does Hiel himself not understand what it is that's unfolding over here? He's losing his oldest son when he begins to rebuild the city, and not the actual city of Yericho, but another city called Yericho, and he still doesn't seem to catch on. So again, I will say this is a tremendous yesod. We all make mistakes in life. And again, when I first make my mistakes, sometimes if it's a brand new mistake, it's understandable that I'm making it. At a certain point in time in life, when you keep on repeating the same mistake over and over, you can't claim ignorance. Again, Hiel is going out and building this city. So he loses his firstborn son, and then another son, then another son. Okay, you want to say that in the beginning, you didn't know what you were doing or what was wrong. But at a certain point in time, it becomes abundantly clear that the way you're living your life and the decisions you're making are having negative consequences. You can't claim ignorance. I will say, I can claim ignorance the first time I make mistakes. I can't claim ignorance when I continue to make the same mistake over and over and suffer the consequences. Incredible. To which the Gemara says, so again, I know who Hiel's kids are, right? So in other words, why do you have to articulate this? That Aviram is his oldest one and Skuv is his youngest one. Why do you have to tell me that Skuv is his youngest son? See, it's interesting. From the pasuk, you would have thought that maybe he just lost Aviram and Skuv. Maybe that's it, just Aviram when he started creating the city, and Skuv when he put up the doors, but maybe there was no other loss. No. He was losing his children successively from Aviram all the way to Skuv. Achav, supposed to listen to this story. Incredible. Achav, Shoshvine Hava. Achav was the friend of Hiel. Now I will say, by the way, when you've got a chevra like that, you know that you're in trouble, right? So obviously Hiel's not a good guy because Hiel's rebuilding Yericho, right? And again, I will say, how else do you see the Achav? Even if you want to say, okay, it was a mistake, like we said before, how do you know that Hiel, unfortunately, again, was a spiritually compromised individual because he keeps going down a path, even though he recognizes that there are spiritually deleterious results. Like he keeps on engaging in bad behavior, seeing immediate consequences, and yet does not stop, keeps going. Okay, so now he's sitting Shiva for his kids. Who comes to Menachem Abel? We're going to see Sa'achav was his friend. Listen to this. Asaihu ve'elio lemishal b'shalma beitamya. So let's get ready for this. Elio, right? Elio Hanavi walks in together with Achav. We saw Achav. Remember again, we saw Achav. We just saw Achav. One of the kings who doesn't have a chelik in Olam Haba. So Elio Hanavi walks in with Achav to pay a shiva visit to Hiel. Hiel sitting in shiva. Elio and Achav walking together. Yosef v'Kamar. So ultimately, again, they walk in and what happens? And Achav begins to speak because everyone's trying to figure out, like Hiel, like what happened over here? You know, why did you lose your kids? So Achav says, Dilma. Kimelet Yoshua hachi lot. Kimelet Yoshua hachi lot lo yericha Hashem iracheres v'lo iracheres Hashem yericho. So listen to this. Achav is like, Hiel, I just realized something. Maybe when Yoshua cursed Yericho, he said not only are you not allowed to rebuild Yericho instead of Yericho, but you also can't build another city called Yericho even somewhere else. And maybe Hiel. Maybe that's why you just lost your kids. Just came to me, right? It just all came together. So I'm like, Elio says, yeah, shkayach, yeah, right, yes, that is correct, and that's what happens when you don't pay attention in shir, right? In other words, we spoke about this, right? We spoke about this, that is the halacha. Amalei. So listen to this. Achav, such a mechusav. It says, Ashta, lavtasa de Moshe lo kakaima. So Achav says, I don't get it. Even the curses of Moshe Rabbeinu don't come true. What a statement, right? Even the curses of Moshe Rabbeinu don't come true. How do I know this? Listen to this. V'sartem v'avaratem, right? The pasuk says that if you worship Avodah Zarah, so Hashem says He's going to punish you. Uksiv v'chara af Hashem b'chem v'tzaras hashamayim. And what happens? What's one of the punishments? Hashem says, I'm going to withhold the rain. So listen to this. Achav says, Vahu Gabra. He's talking about himself. And me? Ogim le'avodas kochavim. I'll call telim v'telim v'lo shavek le'mitra the mezel miskad le. And Achav says, you know what? I've put Avodah Zarah on every single mountain of earth in Eretz Yisrael. And yet, it rains so much in Eretz Yisrael that I can't even visit my Avodah Zarah. So you hear what Achav is saying? He's saying, I don't understand. Moshe Rabbeinu's curses don't come true. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu says, if you worship Avodah Zarah, the rain's not going to come. Achav says, not true. I worship more Avodah Zarah than anyone. Right? I put Avodah Zarah everywhere. And yet again, it rains so much in Eretz Yisrael that I can't even reach my Avodah Zarah. So you see from here, the curses of Moshe Rabbeinu don't come true. L'tasa di Yoshua Talmidim Akaima. Is it possible that the curse of Yoshua, the Talmud, do come true? This is Achav's kasha in the Shiva home. Miyad, so ultimately, what happened? Elio was so incensed. Elio Navi was so upset. About this chutzpah, about this tremendous chutzpah, that he swears there won't be any more rain. And what happens? So by Rachami Aklida the Mitra, the Kamva Azal. So what happened? Elio Navi davened to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He asked Hashem, give me the key to rain. And Elio Navi Kiviyachal locked the heavens. There was a massive drought. No more rain. What happened? The Azal, Elio left. Eliyahu went into hiding. Vayhi dvar Hashem elav vayomer lecha mizeh panisa lach keid mavin istart benachal Chris va'arvim meviim lo lechem u'basar bavoker. So what happened? Eliyahu went into hiding, and obviously went into hiding. He was not a very popular guy because his curse plunged Eretz Yisrael into regional drought and famine. See, he's in hiding. How is he surviving in hiding? Every single day the ravens bring him bread and meat in the morning. The Gemara says, Mehecha, by the way, where the ravens bring him food from? Interestingly enough, they're bringing him bread and meat from the kitchen of Achav. Right, fascinating. From the kitchen of Achav. So literally, again, he's hiding from Achav, and every day the birds are bringing him food from the kitchen of Achav. So ultimately, again, I was saying, obviously, at a certain point, the drought becomes critical, and literally, again, there's no water. There's no water, right? The streams dried up in Eretz Yisrael. And I will say, here's the issue. This is fascinating. So now Hashem needs to bring rain. I will say, but Kiviyachol, listen to this. Kiviyachol, Chakadosh Baruch Hu couldn't. Kiviyachol, why? Because Eliyahu Hanavi was holding the keys to rain, right? He had the key. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to get the key back, so to speak, from Eliyahu Hanavi. So what happens? So what happens? Suppose so now Eliyahu Hanavi goes to Tzarfas, right? There's Isha Tzarfas. So what happens? We know the famous story. Her son, now she hosted Eliyahu Hanavi. It was tremendous. Her son becomes ill and dies. Eliyahu Hanavi supplicates to Hashem. He wants to bring the young boy back to life. Right? By rachame lemesan leaklida de tchias hamesim. So Eliyahu Hanavi asks Hakadosh Baruch Hu, please give me the key to resurrection. It's not fair. It's not right. This woman hosted me so beautifully. I want to bring this boy back to life. Give me the key of tchias hamesim. Amri lei. So Hakadosh Baruch Hu says to Eliyahu, shalosh maftechos l'nimsru l'shliach. In general, there are three keys, Hakadosh Baruch Hu says, that I never give out to anyone else. What three keys? Shal chaya, v'shal geshamim, v'shal tchias hamesim. The key of childbirth, the key of rain, and the key of resurrection. So again, the problem is, Eliyahu, you now have the key of rain. If I give you the key of resurrection, Yomru, shtayim biyad talmud ve'echa biyad arav, people are going to say, the Rebbe has one key, and the Talmud has two keys. Eliyahu, you're going to have the key to rain and the key to resurrection? Impossible. I see her, v'shakal, I'll make you a deal. Give me back the key to rain, and ultimately again I'll give you the key of resurrection. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately again forced Eliyahu, so to speak, to give back the key to rain and end the regional drought in Israel. So we'll say there's so much to say about that story. All right, a different time. Darshahu Galila Kamed Rav Chisda. This is great. So a certain Galilean, right, darshan in front of Rav Chisda, Mashal Doma. What could the servant Eliyahu be compared to? Legavra detrika legalia va'avdi lemaftecha, to someone who locked the storehouse and then lost the key. So Eliyahu he locked the heavens, prevented the rains, but then he himself lost the key to open it back up. The key was given back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Darash Rabbi Yossi b'tzipori. Listen to this. Rabbi Yossi darash in the following idea in Tzipori. Abba Eliyahu. I will say, by the way, what a beautiful way to refer to Eliyahu Hanavi. And I will say, I just want to point out, how incredible is it? Just a couple of days before Pesach, when Amir Hashem Eliyahu is going to join us at our Seder, and we're learning about Eliyahu Hanavi. So listen to this. Abba Eliyahu. Amud Beis. Kaptan Hava. Listen to this. So Rabbi Yossi says, Abba Eliyahu was a kaptan. Now, what does kaptan mean? Rashi says over here, kaptan. Amud Beis. Last time, ahaya kaptan. Shekas al acha va'amar chay Hashem imi Hashem ma'ila tal v'matar. So Rabbi Yossi said Eliyahu Hanavi was very makbid. In other words, he had a strict temperament. Now, it doesn't mean, it means he got angry, but kaptan doesn't necessarily mean that one gets angry. Kaptan means just that one is very exacting. So in other words, he's at the Shiva visit, he's sitting there with Achav. Achav makes this incredulous statement, right? And Achav says, Moshe Rabbeinu's curses don't come true. I'm the biggest Oved Avodah Zarah in the world, and yet it's still raining. And Eliyahu Hanavi is like, I was going to use the word triggered by that, but you can't use that word anymore, right? He was angered by that, and he acted immediately. But I say, do you know what life is all about? Life is all about the ability to hear people say stupid and hurtful things and move on. You can't react to every single thing that people say, because then you will spend your entire life in reactive mode. So Rabbi Yossi says, Eliyahu, You got to learn to let things slide, even if it's achav. Even if it's achav. So therefore, again, Rabbi Yossi said, Abba was a captain. He heard stuff and he was reactive. He did not know how to just go ahead and let things slide. So listen to this. This is great. So Eliyahu used to have a chavrusa with Rabbi Yossi. Used to have a chavrusa with Rabbi Yossi every single day. So what happened? Listen to this. After this statement, Eliyahu got upset. What happened? Yomi. He didn't show up for 3 days. He didn't show up for 3 days. When he finally came after 3 days, Rabbi Yosef said, no, what happened to you? What happened to you? Right? Why didn't you show up for a chavrusa? So Amrulay, Captain Karisili. Well, I got upset. I got upset. Why did I get upset? Because you called me a captain. Rabbi Yossi said, yeah, exactly. Right? By the way, both say, just word, do not engage in these kind of conversations with Eliyahu Navi, right? If Eliyahu Navi shows up, just say Shalom Aleichem, whatever he wants to do, just do. So Amarle, had the come on, the kapid mar. So he says, exactly, this is why I called you a captain. Ultimately, again, at the end of the day, because you get a little bit too angry. Now, I will say, by the way, this is the midah. Eliyahu Navi, remember, who's Eliyahu Navi? Eliyahu Navi is Pinchas, right? So Eliyahu Navi is a kanoi. He's a zealot. He is a captain. He's a captain, and specifically, ultimately, again, when he sees things that are done that are an affront to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he can't take it. He has to react, and because he has to react, ultimately, which is by the way, interestingly enough, why Eliyahu Navi, right? Eliyahu Navi shows up 2 times. He shows up at a bris. He comes to every single bris. That's for a different reason, because he claims that Klal Yisrael had forsaken the covenant to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Rebbe Shal makes him come to every single bris. And we'll say, and what happens? Where's the other place he shows up? At the Leil HaSeder. Right? We pour a beautiful cup for him at the Leil HaSeder. And we'll say, why do we go ahead? Why does he show up at the Seder? And we'll say, generally, a lot of times the Seder becomes a little bit chaotic, right? For a lot of us, right? At any given Seder, you have a lot of different opinions about what to do, right? This one wants to go fast. This one wants to go slow. This one wants a Devar Torah. This one wants to eat. This one wants to sleep. This one wants dessert. This one wants afikomen. This one is taking out their paper to measure the shear for matzah, and the other one's like, what's the matter with you, right? And again, and I will say, if you think about it, sometimes there is no greater place for everyone to get upset at each other than the Seder. But yet, again, what the beauty of the Seder and the tremendous Yeshuas of the Seder is when a family and friends are able to navigate together and not get upset at one another. So Eliyahu Navi shows up, and Eliyahu Navi shows how even people with differences of opinion and different mahalchim are able to come together around the table and create a beautiful experience. It's a little bit of a Musar Haskell for Eliyahu Navi also. That sometimes, again, not everything is perfect, but what the beauty of it is the ability to live with one another, to coexist with one another, even if not everything is exactly as it should be. And Eliyahu Navi comes to every single Seder, and what we want him to see at our Seder, more than anything, is Shalom. Want them to be able to see a sense of peace. Want them to be able to see a family that gets along together, a community that gets along together, friends that get along together, and people who may have a variety of different opinions sitting around the table, but you're still able to coexist b'shalom. That's what Eliyahu Navi, because again, Eliyahu Navi was the captain. Chashbar Baruch Hu says, okay, you got to take it down a little bit, because people aren't perfect. But let me show you how even imperfect people are able to get along with each other. Eliyahu Navi goes house to house to house, Seder to Seder, to be able to see the shalom within the Siddharim of Klal Yisrael. Incredible. I'll say, last piece of Gemara. As long as Risham are in the world, there is anger, divine anger in the world. Man Rishayim. Who are the Rishayim that we're referring to over here? So the Gemara says, Man Rishayim, Amrav Yosef Ganvi, Ganovim. Which is fascinating. Why is the Ganav the paradigmatic Rosh? It's very simple. Because we'll say the Ganav does not respect the other. That, at the end of the day, a thief just doesn't respect anyone else. He doesn't care about anyone else. That is the greatest level of rishus, when you can't respect your fellow Jew. When you can't, you don't have to agree, but when you can't respect your fellow Yid, that's rishus. When that exists in the world, ultimately, again, there's divine wrath. So the Gemara says, Ten Rabbanan, Rasha b'ali olam, Charan b'ali olam. When Rasha comes to the world, there's anger in the world. Shnei Amar, Bevo Rasha ba gam avuz vim kolon cherpa. Rasha ad min ha'olam, tova b'ali olam. When the Rasha disappears from the world, then there is good in the world. Shnei Amar, Uba'avad Risha'im Rina. When the Risha'im are lost, there is joy. Sadik niftar min ha'olam. When a tzaddik dies, tzaddik leaves the world, ra'a ba'al olam. Ultimately, again, evil comes to the world. Shneimar hatzadik avad ve'ein ish sam al leiv v'anshei chesed ne'asafim ve'ein mevin ki mipnei hara ne'asaf hatzadik. So we'll say very profound. This is why when a tzaddik dies, I will say, even if the tzaddik is old, there's a profound sadness that's there. Because when the tzaddik dies, there's his goodness, his gudkeit, leaves the world as well. Tzaddik bali olam, when a tzaddik comes to the world, tova bali olam. Ultimately, again, there is good that comes to the world as well. Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, this one will console us from our actions and from the sadness of our hands. Now, Bosai, it's fascinating to see, right? The Gemara statement, Tzaddik bali olam, tova bali olam. Tzaddik comes to the world, ultimately good comes to the world. And Bosai, who's the example of this? Who's the example of this? This pasuk is by who? Is by Noach. Bosai, how intriguing is it that the Gemara chooses to illustrate this concept with Noach, right? After all, again, there's a raging machlokus about Noach. Was Noach a tzaddik, right? B'darosav. Was he an objective tzaddik, right? Or was he a subjective tzaddik, right? Was he just a tzaddik because he lived in a generation of Rishayim? Or was he objectively righteous? So it's fascinating that the Gemara chooses to illustrate this principle of tzaddik bali olam. When a righteous person comes to the world, good comes to the world. Oh, who's the example of that? Noach. So what's the pshat? So I will say, if you think about it for just a moment, this is what we just said. What does the Gemara quote? Zeyinach Aminu. Now, by the way, why does it say Zeyinach Aminu? Why does it say that Noach will console us? Rashi HaKadosh quotes the Medrash that says, what did Noach invent? Noach invented farming utensils. Up until Noach, they had to farm with their hands. He invented farming utensils. Or essentially, Noach was one of the first people to do something meaningful and significant for the other. Now let's say, what is the definition of a tzaddik? A tzaddik is a person who cares enough to live outside of himself. A tzaddik is a person who cares enough to live outside of his immediate family, to recognize that my life is not about me. My life is about what can I do for the klal? What can I do for my community? What can I do for those around me? That's a tzaddik. Learning Torah by itself does not create tzaddikim, because learning Torah by itself could very easily and very beautifully be viewed as a self-serving avodah. I love it. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. So what makes a tzaddik a tzaddik? Of course, you need the Torah. But what really makes a tzaddik is a person who doesn't spend his life thinking about himself. Is a person who spends his life thinking about trying to figure out, what can I do for the other? How can I make a difference in the lives of others? If you could be a kind of person who brings nechama ultimately to others, another person, when they see another person who is tzibrochen, who is broken, who is sad, could be the kind of person that could step in and make a difference. That's a tzaddik. Noach might not have been spiritually perfect. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. It's machlokes. But at the end of the day, he cared enough to do for the other. He cared enough to make a difference for the other. And I will say, if you think about it, by the way, it's just fascinating. In just literally 30 more seconds. You know, Sfarim bring down that there's always a connection between the beginning of the Masechta and the end of the Masechta. Right? So the end of the Masechta is Noach, right? And Noach ultimately, again, what's a tzaddik? Someone who is there for others. There's a parent being there for others. And I will say, if you think about it, how does the Masechta begin? You're like, I have no idea, right? How did the Masechta begin? So the Masechta began with the phrase, Dinei Mamanis B'Shlosha, which again meant, right, if you want to adjudicate monetary cases, you need a beis din of 3, right? I've often thought that there's another way to read the Mishnah also. There are a lot of different problems in life. There's Dinei Mamanis problems, right? There's Gzelos v'chavalos problems, injuries, difficulties, sadness, sickness, nezek v'chatzi nezek, damages, right? These are all the different kinds of issues in life. Ones and mefata, there's immorality problems, right? There's all kinds of issues in life. How do you navigate the issues, the difficulties in life? And there's always one answer. B'shlosha, 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 b'shlosha. You can't navigate life alone. You have to be there for you. All of us need other people, and we need to be there for other people. It is so tempting to kind of just live in your own Dalet Amos and just worry about yourself and worry about your own. But that's not what makes tzaddikim, and it's not what makes Klal Yisrael. What makes Klal Yisrael is that whatever we have to go through, whatever dinei mamanas, chavalas, hazekos, whatever it is, b'shlosha. As long as we're there for each other, whatever the challenge is, we will get through it together. That's how the Masechta begins. And how does the Masechta end? What's a tzaddik? A tzaddik is a Noach. Because when you are the kind of person who is there for others, when you're the kind of person who cares for others, that ultimately, again, is what creates tzaddikim for Klal Yisrael. I will say so much more to say, so much more to say, so much more to. What? The Rambam, yes, I hear the Rambam. I also owe you Rav Levi Yitzchak Berdichev on the story with Achav and the Eliyahu Navi. Again, Semirat Hashem, tomorrow. We'll get to it tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll continue. We'll say a tremendous shkoyach to everyone. Again, details for the Siyum forthcoming in Meretz Hashem. Ramordi is going to make our Siyum tomorrow. Tomorrow morning we begin with Seches Makkos. Again, we'll say what a journey. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give us the koch to continue to learn together, to grow together for many years to come. Shkoyach, everyone.
You have 5 minutes today for me to ask you to navigate a halachic quandary.
Yeah, you want to call me this afternoon?
Yeah.
After 1.
Okay, Miss Samuel. Thank you.